On today's episode, we'll review the massive G.I. Joe Compendium Vol.1 paperback version. We'll take a look at the positives and negatives of the reprint of the 1980s original Marvel run, issues 1 through 50. Is it worth it? Is it a must-have for Joe fans? Stay tuned and we'll try to answer those questions and more in today's review. First of all, I think that the original G.I. Joe Marvel run is absolutely worth it for any Joe fan. And there are a variety of ways of obtaining those issues, from hunting down old issues from the 1980s and early 90s, which can get quite expensive, to collecting reprinted issues of the late 80s and early 90s, such as Tales of G.I. Joe, which was a little bit better quality than the original run, but still expensive to collect nowadays, to collecting a variety of later dated reprint, both hardcover and paperback versions of the original run by different publishers and date, such as IDW's Rise of Serpentor, which contains issues 46 to 53 of the original run, plus some special missions issues and one yearbook issue. However, this last option tends to be much more expensive and also incomplete if you're trying to collect the entire run. But why do you need to collect any of these versions of the original G.I. Joe comic book run? Well, the original run was written by the godfather of G.I. Joe mythology himself, Larry Hama, the same fellow that wrote all the figure file cards, which were included on the packaging of every G.I. Joe and Cobra figure that was sold in the original Aura line. Hama wrote all but a few, and I counted 3 issues in the first volume of the compendium of the entire original 155 issue run. Hama, a Vietnam vet, used his experience and knowledge to give an air of reality to the stories he told in the comics. Throughout the comic, military jargon, specific names of armament, and military tactical plans are often used, which, without Hama's experience, would likely be missed if written by someone else. It's the writing that gives the stories of the comic an air of military reality. That, plus the more violent storytelling, and yes, people including Joe's and Cobra are killed throughout the original run, is what separates the comic book storytelling from the much more family-friendly version of the Sunbow 1980s cartoon. But it's just not the military quasi-reality used throughout the comic that makes it a must-have for any Joe fan. It's also the origin stories of main G.I. Joe characters explored through the original comic run that gives us fans more insight into the characters themselves. Most of those origin stories are in the first 50 issues contained in Volume 1 of the Compendium. We learn of Snake Eyes' origin story and also of Storm Shadow's story and why their lives remain intertwined throughout G.I. Joe lore. Want to know why Snake Eyes wears a mask? The answer is within the first 50 issues. Want to know what he looks like under the mask? The answer is in a later issue of the original run, but not in the first 50 issues. Want to know why Storm Shadow was part of Cobra, but then became part of the G.I. Joe team? The answer is in the comics. The most recent G.I. Joe movie, Snake Eyes, was a, let's say, bastardized version of the original Hama story. The origin story of Cobra Commander and Cobra itself is explored within the first 50 issues. The creation and rise of Serpentor is presented within the first 50 issues. The relationships between Destro and the Baroness, Flint and Lady J, and Snake Eyes and Scarlet all have their beginning in the first 50 issues. New characters that we never got in the original cartoon or toy run are introduced in the first 50 issues. We are introduced to Quinn, Dr. Venom, General Flag, you know, that guy that the USS Flag is named after, Cobra Commander's son, Billy, who goes on to play a pivotal role in Hama's storyline later in the comics. We are introduced to the CG's Freds, and in particular Fred 7, who plays an integral part in Cobra Commander's history and a pivotal role in the Cobra Civil War, which we are later introduced in the comic book issues. In the first 50 issues, we learn of Storm Shadow and Snake Eyes and Stalker's history in the Vietnam War, and meet a fourth fellow by the name of Wade Collins. Both the Hard and Soft Master are introduced in the first 50 issues that play an integral part of the Snake Eye, Storm Shadow storyline. Hama provides new characters in addition to the action figure characters to give depth and intrigue to this storytelling, which only piques our interest and enjoyment as fans in the lore of G.I. Joe. It's Hama's storytelling that separates the comics from the original cartoons, making the storylines much more complex, serious, and at times darker, including characters that are killed throughout the original run. which we certainly didn't get in the Sunbow cartoon. Okay, so exploring Hama's version of G.I. Joe mythology is a must if you're a Joe fan. But is the paperback version of the Compendium a must-have for us Joe fans? Well, let's explore. Let's first start off with the positives. The first is cost. It's much cheaper collecting the first 50 issues of the original run than chasing down all original 50 issues that can run anywhere between $2 to $5 Canadian per issue, with some issues such as issue number 1, number 21, Snake Eye Origin Stories, issue 34, costing much, much more. Buying the paperback version of the Compendium Vol.1 is the cheapest way and fastest way of getting a copy of the first 50 issues of Larry Hama's story of G.I. Joe, which, in my opinion, is required reading for any Joe fan. Another positive is the weight of the book. It's the very first thing that you'll notice when you hold this massive book in your hand. I was expecting something similar to weight to those old school yellow pages, but it's incredibly light. This makes it easy to transport the first 50 issues around as compared to transporting 50 individual issues, at least within your house. Want to take the first 50 issues with you on a trip or even to your patio or backyard? This compendium makes it easy to do so. And because we have 50 issues bound together, it also makes it easy to flip through issues. No need to dig up old issues, pull them out of baggies to go over an early issue that is referred to in an issue that we are currently reading. The original run issues refer to back issues on a regular basis. Want to do a quick review on what happened in an earlier issue? Well, it's a lot easier if you have all the back issues already in your hand in one book compared to looking through past individual issues. Hama would also tell stories in multiple issues. For example, Snake Eye's origin story is a 2-issue part, although it does go further than that only a few issues later. Other stories span over 4 or 5 issues. The compendium makes it easy to just keep reading all in one city instead of going through each issue separately. I also found it interesting to compare the artwork of the pencils or finishes, that is, that the individuals that draw the arc, personal renditions of the characters. Right on the cover, there are 3 names listed other than Hama's. Herb Tremp, or Trempe, not sure how to pronounce that, Mike Vosberg, and Rod Wigham. These are the fellows that primarily drew the characters, and although Frank Springer's name doesn't appear on the cover, there are easily 15 to 20 issues in Volume 1 where he is credited as the pencil or finisher. Why wasn't he named on the cover? I'm not sure, but I'm sure there's an interesting story behind that, and if any of you know why, then please do share in the comments because I'd be interesting to learn. Having all these issues bound together, you can easily see the difference in artwork between all 4 pencils. Just look at the difference between Vosberg's Scarlet and Wingham's or Trempe's or Springer's version of Scarlet. You really can't compare the difference in these 4 men's artistic interpretation of what the characters look like, at least from their individual perspectives. One interesting note, however, is that neither of these 3 men listed on the cover of the compendiums drew the art for either arguably the most famous issue, issue number 21, Silent Interlude, or the 2-part Snake Eyes origin story. It makes you think. So those are the positives of the paperback version of Compendium Volume 1. Let's take a look at the negatives, and unfortunately, there are a lot more of those than there are positives. The paperback version printing quality is poor. The paper used isn't glossy or vibrant in color, which is expected with a much more cheaper paperback version of the compendium. But the paper itself feels like a thicker original comic book print, but still thinner than the paper used in the Tales of G.I. Joe print. At times, dialogue bubbles are hard to read as the print gets lighter, and on rare occasions, words are partially missing. The picture panels don't seem to be centered on the page, or at least consistently centered. At times, with the first few issues, some panels are partially printed right off the page. I get it. You get what you pay for, but printing panels partially off the page itself is simply unacceptable. There is also no index to this version of the compendium. This is odd, as you'd expect that a book containing 50 issues would have an index at the beginning, making it easier for the reader to find those earlier issues that are often referred to throughout the book. However, even if this version of the compendium had an index, it wouldn't help the reader find that issue that you're looking for, because the pages aren't numbered anyways. This is odd, considering that even the original Marvel run had page numbering. Although some of the issues in the compendium do have page numbering, but most don't, those numbers were drawn in the original panels of the comics. So if the originals didn't have numbering, neither does the compendium. Regardless, the numbering in the panels are specific to the one issue, and doesn't correspond to the total pages of the companion. I found this frustrating, as I often flipped 2 pages at a time instead of one without numbering on the pages. I had to rub my fingers hard enough to separate the pages, but not hard enough to tear through the poor quality paper. Another negative was that because of the size of the companion, the book is awkward to read. I found myself needing a flat surface like a table or even a floor to set the book while I read it. While comparably light in weight to an old school Yellow Pages, trying to hold it with one hand while flipping through the pages will tire your holding hand rather quick. Also, because of the sheer size of the book, reading the dialogue that is set in the panels closest to the center of the book makes it difficult to read. I often found myself constantly adjusting the book so I could read the entire dialogue that was printed closer to the middle of the book. This is much different than reading the original individual comic books, as you can easily bend back the pages of the issues to read the dialogue closer to the center of the book. Also, transporting this massive book is much more difficult than taking 4 or 5 issues along with you on your next trip camping or vacationing elsewhere. Yes, having this size of book allows you to have 50 issues together. However, to transport it to and from makes it very difficult. Just because of the sheer size of it, it is highly unlikely that I would take the compendium with me anytime I leave my house, or at least the backyard. Outside of the printing issue or the sheer size of the book, the compendium falls short for me when it comes to capturing that nostalgic feeling that I get when I read the original comic book run. First off, for whatever reason, the dates that were printed on every first page of the original run wasn't included in the compendium. Personally, I look at the year of each issue I read. I automatically calculate how old I was in 1988 or 1990 and what I was doing, where I was living, etc. on that date when that specific issue was published. It simply adds to the nostalgia feel for me. Also, I often found myself looking for the date on the issue, wondering when Storm Shadow or some other G.I. Joe character was going to make an appearance. If I was reading an issue that came out in 1983, then I knew I wasn't going to see Storm Shadow until at least reaching the 1984 issues, when the action figure was released. Without the year being printed on the first page of that issue, I often found myself returning to issue 1 of the companion, then flipping through the issues months until getting to the issue I was reading in order to figure out what year that particular issue was published. And this only works if you know that the issue number 1 was first published in June of 1982. A trivial fact, I know, but again, it all adds to the nostalgic feels for me. Also missing from the companion was the printed letters to the editor that were, for the most part, answered by whom I'm assuming were Larry Hama and others who were involved in creating the original stories. Always printed at the end of each issue, under the heading of Postbox The Pit, the questions allows the reader to transport themselves back in time, as specific references and wording used in those questions often took me back to 1987 or 88 or 1989, etc. Absolute nostalgia gold. Also, the responses to those questions, at times short, often provided some insight into the creative thought process of Larry Hama and the men and women involved in the creation of G.I. Joe lore itself. Personally, I would have enjoyed the compendium much more had it been printed with every page of Postbox The Pit that was included in every issue of the original Marvel run. Finally, the last negative for me was the compendium does not include any of the advertisement contained in the first 50 issues of the original run. And that's for obvious reasons. It wouldn't make any sense that a compendium would include ads for the original NES, Huffy Bikes, or the NBC Saturday morning lineups. I get it. There are also maybe some copyright issues there as well. I get that as well. But the whole purpose of collecting these comics for me is the same reason I collect the original action figures, to capture that nostalgic feeling. Without that purpose, I lose interest in collecting. Collecting retro comics or toys or video games or anything else from when we were kids or teenager needs to capture that nostalgic feel. It needs to unlock memories that have been forgotten long ago. And if reading fan mail at the end of each issue in the original run transports me back, a la riding, let's say, next to Marty McFly in the DeLorean to when I was 8 or 9 or 10 years old, the 1980s and early 90s advertisement, the ones that you see in original comic transports me in a supersonic jet speeding at warp 10 right back to 1986 or 1989 or 1992, whatever. Right away, that nostalgic feels hits hard when I flip the page and there's an ad for something I haven't seen in years. Sadly, the compendium with all its Larry Hama storytelling glory falls short in capturing that nostalgic feeling that flipping through the original comics captured. So there you have it, folks. Is the paperback version of the G.I. Joe Compendium Vol.1 a must-have for Joe fans? No, not for this Joe fan. Originally, I had planned to buy Volume 3 as well to complete my collection of Larry Hama's story. However, after reading Volume 1 from cover to cover, I won't be doing that. I know that I'll be paying much more and that it will take me much longer to complete the last 45 issues or so of the run to complete my collection, but for this Joe fan, it's worth it. Well, that's it for me, folks. I thank you for watching, and I appreciate all of you that took time out of your day to watch my video. For those of you interested in a personal memory that reviewing these comic books unlocked for me, then stay tuned. G.I. Joe for me in 1985 was simply a toy line with a really great corresponding cartoon. I didn't collect the comic, I didn't even know of its existence until I started collecting the comic, nor did I know that the comic itself was older than the cartoon. When the original Sunbow cartoon ended in 1986, the G.I. Joe story came to an abrupt end for me, so I went looking for a G.I. Joe storyline somewhere, anywhere else, and I found it in 1987 with Larry Hama's Marvel's comic run of G.I. Joe. Now, being anal at age 11, I simply didn't start with whatever issue had just come out, but instead bought the earliest issue I could find so that I could read the story sequentially as the authors had intended. I think that I started with issue maybe 52, and then I found an issue 51, and then I started collecting from that awesome cover issue 53 with Snake Eyes on it. It became a weekly thing for me. However, my allowance only allowed me to buy one issue per week with a baggie and a cardboard backing to keep the comic as pristine as possible. Yes, I was that anal at 11 years old. That allowance, however, didn't come to me for free and just nilly-willy. I had to do my household chores first, and usually I did those chores on Saturday afternoons because, as I'm sure all of you in the 1980s, we are all occupied on Saturday morning. And only after completing those chores would my mother give me a few quarters, nickels, and dimes so that I could walk up the street to my local comic book store that's still there today, called Comic Land, to buy that issue. This became routine for me. Until one devastating day, the price of that baggie and cardboard backing went up in price. I was given the option of buying either the baggie or the cardboard backing, but not both. So I chose the baggie. At least I'd keep my comic clean, I thought. So, comic and baggie in hand, I moped back home, and usually I'd run right into my room and read my comic. But not that day. I was crushed. So upset that I didn't even want to read that week's issue. My mother saw me moping around. Very unusual for me in the 1980s, especially on a Saturday. So she asked me, what's wrong? And I explained to her the devastating news that I had received on my most recent visit to Comic Land. My mother, being proudful, and knowing how hard I had worked for those few quarters and nickels and dimes, thought it unfair that the fellow behind the register simply just didn't cut me a break and give me that cardboard backing. So she replied to me in her usual proudful manner, no problem. From now on, I'll increase your allowance so that you can buy that comic, baggie, and cardboard backing. Now, I can't remember what that increase was by, if it was 10 cents or 5 cents or 15 cents, but she handed me that change and set me on my way, demanded that I march back to that store and get that cardboard backing. So I walked back to the comic book store, entered the store with newly found confidence that had just been bestowed upon me by my mother and a little bit of attitude, and I approached the owner, who just 30 minutes before had denied me what I had worked for so hard that afternoon to earn. With an almost flippant attitude, I presented him the change in my hand and I demanded from him one piece of cardboard. The exchange for cash for cardboard was made, and I promptly stomped out of that store without uttering one other single word to him. I learned an important lesson that day on how to stand up for myself, a lesson that I would never forget. As I walked back home, I was on cloud 9 with a 10 by 7 inch piece of cardboard in my hand. Silly, I know. I could have easily cut out a backing from one of the mini cereal boxes I had at home that day, I'm sure, but that wouldn't have been authentic. That wouldn't have been the real piece from the comic book store, something that I had worked hard to earn that day. That piece of cardboard is still with me here today somewhere with the comics here. the very comic that I bought that day, which is part of the collection that I still have. I just don't know which one it is, but I still have that piece of cardboard backing with me. I guess that's the very reason I collect. I guess that's the very reason many of you collect toys, comics, video games, household items from our childhood. Because it brings us back a flood of memories of more innocent times, of more simpler times. When we were 7 or 10 or 12, when something so irrelevant and insignificant as a piece of cardboard could make your whole day and sometimes even make your whole week. Anyways, folks, that's it for me. Until next time, I wish all of you happy memory hunting.